All right, so we both responded to Rachel Oates' video about Not All Men. We both
Mhm.
kind of opposed it. And I find that although a lot of people are anti feminists or anti SJW or whatever, it seems to
Yeah.
me like they take that position for different reasons. And it
Yeah.
may be the case that we oppose yes all men for different reasons, possibly. So do you want to like explain your position on that?
My reasons both interconnect, and depending on what approach the person posting something on the issue, there's something else which needs addressing.
I have a few notes
Yeah.
here based on
Mhm.
like what you said.
Reaching adulthood, it's usually in the case to be considered man or woman, only in the case of women. This is my experience noticing different cultures, the behavior men have towards women, women have towards men, and so on.
So I think what you're trying to get at is that for women, it's enough to be at the age of consent. Like they're
Yeah.
intrinsically valued by society, whereas men must actively go out of their way to perform their function and to satisfy women before they're considered true men.
Close-ish. Also, not necessarily to satisfy women, but to be seen, be interacted with very favorably. The way men and women are socialized is somewhat different in the sense that women, either instinctually and in the way they socialize, teach each other how to best interact when it comes to men. But both the expectations women have on men through their actions, not through what they want to believe, is different. And the things men have to do to be seen as great by women is more than what women need to do towards men, and it's something men are not socialized into.
Sure. I mean, I would
If
say
I,
that like women also have, social expectations put upon them as well.
yeah,
I'm pretty sure like there's this whole other side of the equation. But you also said in your video that like this arrangement isn't necessarily unfair. I mean, generally it seemed in your response video that you were in favor of gender roles and you were in favor of, traditional masculinity and femininity. Aren't those the
yeah.
same expectations that, trap us and make us forced to do things that we don't want?
The way I consider gender is that the expectations, both put on men and on women, when they were formed over generations, centuries ago, the way they lasted for so long is that they were beneficial. So gender was constructed in such a way that it benefited both men and women, the roles they have. People over time, using tradition, forgot the reason why the roles were there and why they are used to benefit. So they imposed it forcefully without understanding it. And the limitations, the constraints, the expectations which are negative come from this lack of understanding of why gender is there, at least in my opinion.
So you think that like gender itself as defined by biology and as defined by evolution isn't necessarily bad then? It's just the way we interpret it is wrong?
Somewhat, but gender is social.
I agree. So how do you know whether some aspect of gender and gender roles is biological and evolutionary or social?
Well, gender in general is social. I mean, imposed by society, expected in interaction with society. They are somehow based from natural tendencies and from biological functions, which men are, on average, more suited towards, but applied in society.
All right, because you said in your video that the more you think about it, the more you think masculine men and feminine women are beneficial to society, and it seemed almost to the exclusion of everyone else. Do you have an explanation for why LGBT plus people exist if they weren't evolved? I would expect that people who don't fit into this, gender dichotomy exist because they were also evolutionarily beneficial.
Yeah, gender minorities, sexual minorities are also evolved. Yeah, family relations and how certain portion of the population being not straight would be contributing to the family structure already existing and not competing for resources additionally. LGBT or GRSM have an evolutionary part, which is beneficial.
Sure. Then why do you like take the extra step of talking about how masculine men and feminine women are especially so valuable? It seems like you're taking a normative position that men should be masculine and women should be feminine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the way I see it is that if LGBT plus people exist and they're here for a biological reason, maybe we should just let everybody do whatever the fuck they want. Wouldn't that closely approximate the desirable outcome of the spread of masculine and feminine traits among the population? Why go out of your way to glorify masculinity or femininity in itself?
Not exactly. Can we agree that the LGBT people are a minority by a long shot, like 20 to 1 in European countries? So no, not in countries which are gender minorities are suppressed. And I saw that usually between 5 and 10% of the population wasn't straight. So can we agree that they are a minority?
Yeah, so if...
By a long shot.
But they're a pretty large minority. I mean, like 10%, that's millions of people. Like, why would you go out of your way to say that masculine men and feminine women are especially valuable when you've got 10% of the population just sitting there? Like, in your ideal society, what would be the place for them?
Integrated in society? I'm not sure what you mean.
What I'm basically getting at is that gender roles they don't seem to be particularly useful, because if your argument is correct that people are like biologically predisposed to act in certain ways, we should just let them do that instead. We don't need to like particularly value whether a man is masculine or a woman is feminine. It seems that it just creates rules and restrictions that basically just oppress people.
No, I disagree. Could you say, just to know what you're thinking about, ways in which masculine behaviors or feminine behaviors are used to oppress?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, for men, it's very easy to see, right? Society tells men you gotta go out and fight in the wars and die like a hero, and that's manly. Or you gotta go to the coal mines and then die like a hero. Shit like that, you know? Like, it's all about sacrificing themselves for the greater whatever. So, I mean, that doesn't seem to be particularly fair to men. And of course, for women, there's the stay in the kitchen, pop out babies, and take care of them, and, you know, raise your children instead of having a life of your own. You know, it doesn't seem right to devote 50% of the population to doing work and the other 50% of the population to raising the next generation so they can do work.
This is that part which I said, which tradition over time diluted and made it harder to see how they're beneficial, why the roles were there. Because the thing you said, negative about masculinity, about sacrifice and fighting wars and such, that is masculine behavior when looked at it through the superficial lens, not looking at why it's beneficial, because sacrifice...
Well, I think it's possible to say that something's both beneficial in some ways and that masculinity can be toxic in other ways.
Can we move a bit to this, what you said with masculinity being toxic for a bit?
Well, sure. Do you understand what toxic masculinity is?
Yeah, but usually I see the behaviors which are described as toxic masculinity as being defective, as in not a valid form of masculinity. Could you talk a bit more about this?
I don't necessarily disagree with you that some forms of masculinity might not necessarily represent what men are supposed to be in their true biological form. But I'm also not sure that there's some way to separate, you know, masculinity and toxic elements that may come as a byproduct of it. It seems to me that if as a society we encourage men to be aggressive and competitive, sulking all the time without making many friends, it seems to be definite that aspects associated with masculinity that would be considered toxic would come along for the ride.
The way I see it is when they are done wrong, when they are in ways which are detrimental, they become less and less aligned with gender. So behaviors which you said are toxic masculinity, the more toxic they are, that would make them increasingly less masculine. You said about this aggressiveness. There are plenty of ways in which to do that right, and when encouraging behaviors of competitiveness, aggressiveness, stoicism, they should be encouraged and also encouraged to be done in ways in which are beneficial.
So how would you do that? Because I mean, I know the feminist solution to this is to tell men not to rape, pile more expectations onto men on how they should behave around women, and try to like add things up until everything evens out and they're no longer toxic. I disagree with that strategy. I think it doesn't really work. My strategy is to be just sensitive to men, treat them with more kindness. This sensitivity side is not something that we as a society teach men. And it seems to me that if we just put them more in our focus and care about them more, like we have never done in the entire history of humankind, perhaps they would be less inclined to do, acts of violence. That's my solution, but what would your solution be if you don't want to get rid of aspects of masculinity?
It's not that I would want to get rid of aspects of masculinity, but to include in ways in which we encourage masculinity, also mechanisms to trim out or to set aside behaviors which become toxic, to also teach ways in which to minimize the behaviors which are described as toxic masculinity.
Yeah, can you provide like an example?
Things that feminists complain about with men and crying. Do you know how they say that part of toxic masculinity is men not expressing their emotions, right?
Yeah, they have terrible mental health these days.
In my opinion, is something which is misunderstood. And when it happens, when men bottle up their emotions, is because they misapply the concept of being in control of their emotions, of not being overwhelmed in crisis situations. For example, let's say that there is a war and one of the soldiers breaks down on the battlefield. That is incredibly harmful both for the person itself and for everyone around him. And part of teaching masculinity would be to teach ways of dealing with this overload in ways in which are manageable. But when it is misunderstood, it eventually becomes this bottling up of emotions.
Okay, so how do you prevent society from misunderstanding it? Because the way it seems to me is, well, men will try to bottle up their emotions on their side and it'll lead to terrible mental health outcomes. And then the society will just tell them to just suck it up and stop crying and go back to work and shit like that, because they're taught that like men don't have feelings and they shouldn't feel bad about men. It seems to me like on both sides of the equation, masculinity in some ways is just hurting men. I don't see that there's a way that you can encourage masculinity without necessarily consigning men to these bad outcomes.
There should be normalization of ways of expressing emotions and showing compassion.
Yeah, it just seems to me like as long as our society is structured around men being responsible for doing all the actions, taking care of their own lives and also taking care of the lives of others, basically they're going to be consigned to a fate of always having to work, and do stuff for others and never have time for themselves. Men are expected to give all the time, and that seems to be fundamental to the nature of what we understand masculinity to be. So unless we alter our fundamental understanding of what masculinity is, it doesn't seem like masculinity is a good thing that we should be encouraging in people. It should just be something people are born with and arrive at themselves, rather than something we tease out of them as a society. When you're responding to Rachel, you talked about the average man. When Rachel was talking about how like women feel unsafe at night because they're physically weaker and stuff like that, you talk about the average man who feels bad because he would never hurt a woman. And I don't disagree with you, but I mean, that's not exactly what we're getting at, right? I mean, most rapes are committed by a very small fraction of men, yet rape is still a problem. So why would you focus...
If I remember the statistics right, one said that 90% of rapes are done by repeat offenders, and I think 0.3% of men do basically all the rapes.
Yeah, so why are we talking about the average man when we're talking about the problem of sexual violence? I mean, it seems like focusing on the average man's innocence, if you were acting in bad faith, which I'm not necessarily saying you are, if you were to do that, it would seem like that would be done to dismiss the sexual violence problem. So why would you focus on the average man?
Because the average man doesn't need this dead on one. The average man already has the tendency to both not do and to want to stop actions like this happening. And the people who would do these kinds of actions wouldn't listen to advocacy like the ones in Teach Men Not Rape. So policy itself is misguided in its application. It wouldn't work in any way, and it would just be additional pressure, like we talked about earlier, with expectation on and which both doesn't need to be there, and it's overall a waste of resources and of narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that like the campaign that we should teach men not to rape, it doesn't do anything because rapists won't listen to that campaign. But there's a difference between saying that and focusing on the average man. What I say is that saying teach men not to rape, it associates rapists with the rest of the men, and it could lead to implicit bias down the road. But it's not as simple as just saying that most men don't rape. And
it's not only that they don't, but they have repulsion and a instinct to stop it. So the vast majority of men already agree with the sentiment before it ever being taught, and perpetuating the narrative that we need to teach men this in addition to it, as if it's not already natural, like if they don't already want to do this, is basically fear-mongering and creating additional tension between the genders.
What I'm mainly getting at is that we both in some way oppose saying yes all men, but I'm not sure that you necessarily have a solution. I'm looking for solutions, and the reason why I think yes all men doesn't work is because blaming men as a general group, basically it will socially ostracize men and could actually, because of their social ostracization, make them more lonely, more depressed, and more socially awkward, and more likely to commit these crimes in the first place. So from my critique of the feminist ideas, I come to the conclusion that instead of blaming men, we should be more sensitive and nicer to them and focus on their problems to down the line solve the problems of women as well. So you see how there's a difference between me looking for a solution and just saying that not all men rape?
Yeah. I'd say, agree on this, because you said the thing about social ostracization and awkwardness. Overall, something I'd have to add to that is that through this mechanism of isolation, men, increasingly more of them, lack the traits and the know-how of how to have healthy interactions with women. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they would make them more likely to contribute to the problem, only a very small portion. The problem which would be more contributed to, more than sexual assault, would be creating more fear that this would happen a lot more, that the awkwardness and the ways in which the men who are isolated wouldn't know how to interact with women would create the impression that even when they are well-intentioned, that they aren't.
Basically, my thesis here is that essentially that us as a society, enforcing masculinity is actually bad, enforcing gender roles is bad, expecting men to come in, swoop in, and individually fix themselves to change the entire society's problems seems to enforce masculinity in a way that's counterproductive. So I'm looking at this from a gender deconstructionist lens and a left-wing point of view, whereas you seem to be more on the right-wing side. Is that more or less correct?
Not necessarily. I am somewhat weird politically because I am both gender normativist and a liberal. But my conception of gender, I've had an attitude which became a lot more favorable towards gender when I looked at it more deeply. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm right-wing, but I sought for a lot of time to understand why people in the right wing hold the beliefs that they do, and I sought to understand what they're saying, even when they don't understand why they're saying it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you made your evolutionary argument. It seems to be kind of like a historical fallacy, isn't it? I mean, sure, for thousands and millions of years, we've had like some vague sense of masculinity and femininity biologically building up within us, but all cultures have not had the same standards of masculinity and femininity. It changes between the cultures. And additionally, whether or not something used to be biologically advantageous in the past doesn't mean it is today, right? I mean, we have the internet, we have all this technology. Our biology is nowhere near caught up with our technical ability. So how do you know that masculinity and femininity still represent some sort of advantage to us.
And you brought up different cultures.
I mean, those cultures had slavery too, right? We had slavery for millions of years. So
that's not relevant right now. Only in terms of gender, what I'd say that differed between them were superficial aspects of gender. What differed between the cultures were ways in which to signal or to symbolize and make easily recognizable the fact that men and women had either masculine or feminine traits. There were different ways to express masculinity and femininity, but the thing which made them masculine or feminine were common, even if there were different ways of expressing it. And you said something else.
Yeah, it was that just because it was done for a long time doesn't mean it currently applies to the modern day. Or that it was right back then. Like, slavery was wrong back then, too.
Slavery wasn't beneficial for the slaves. It's just that with gender, it would be different because gender roles, for the vast majority of people, were beneficial for men and for women.
So you think it was beneficial for all the men to die in the wars, labor away on their land?
That wasn't the expectation. There is, let's say, one society interacting with the hostile society. So you have our society and someone else is hostile towards us. In order to preserve the society in which we live in, it needs to be defended. It wasn't the expectation to die in the war. Dying in a war was the consequence which happened in order to preserve society. The expectation was to defend the family, village life as people knew it back then.
Yeah, but why? I mean, the hostility had to come from somewhere, right? I mean, sure, you had animals, and we don't have animals that we're afraid of, getting eaten by today. So that's no longer relevant. What's relevant is that people are still hostile to each other because humans have a natural desire to form hierarchies. When we're trying to decide whether or not Group A or Group B is going to be on top, that's where war happens. And that sort of competition seems to be connected to masculinity in some way. I don't necessarily see that other than defending ourselves against wild animals and shit like that, masculinity applies today in the same way it did back then.
I think I can connect the thing you said, difference between the past and the modern life. It will sound a little bit unrelated, but ways in which in industrial society we thought things were good for or productive or whatever. They weren't done studying biology, applying them in the long term. We later realized that they have negative consequences. The thing I'm thinking primarily would be, let's say someone works in an office. They're biologically evolved to be outside and hunt and shit. The way, the posture, lack of physical activity over years is detrimental. There need to be ways in which to adapt the current roles and behaviors to match the best way we are evolved for them. For example, there are various companies which have adjustable desks. So there are ways in which society today is discongruent with the way we are best operating in, and we need to change to study and understand these aspects of biology in order to have what's socially normal be most beneficial from this point of view.
We're doing the office example, and before I get to what I want to say about that, I want to just clarify that everything I say, a lot of it can be applied to femininity as well. Like, toxic femininity is a thing too, okay? But yeah, we're talking about offices, and it seems like offices today mirror how societies have worked in the past, and they've kind of been detrimental to men overall. I mean, in the past, we had kings, lords, or chieftains, the patriarch at the top who rules over everything, and all the other men, they just get to work and die in the fields or die on the battlefield. Our propensity for masculinity has given us these natural hierarchies. And as we've moved along in society, we've decided kings, they're no good. But now we've got our corporate overlords ruling over us instead. It seems to be connected to masculinity in the way that it's just forced us into these hierarchies. It seems to be, if not necessarily beneficial to society, it's definitely not beneficial to most men, because most men don't become the business owners. Most men don't become the kings. Most men get to rot at the bottom. It seems like masculinity is uniquely designed to hurt most men so that some men at the top can succeed. I'm not sure that's a good idea for how we want to build our society, which is why, of course, I'm a socialist. The way our society is built should be less hierarchical.
I see this as a bit of a defeatist mindset, and I kind of disagree with this aspect of it.
You talked about a short story that was written by Sargon of Akkad.
I know.
I don't know if that's particularly responsible. The story was basically a straw man of all the feminazis you find on the very edges of Twitter. You realize those don't represent feminists as a whole, right? Like, I criticized feminism a lot in my video, but in no way did I imply that feminism as a group hated men, or that they would like dock people for being white and shit like that. I don't know. It doesn't seem like feminism actually means fighting for female interests, and it seems kind of irresponsible to use a short story that strawmans feminists that way.
Do you have any experience with either people working in government structures or in corporations and with bureaucracy?
Not particularly more than other people.
Usually, the solutions which governments and corporations come to, the way they're enforced, they are very ineffective. They strip away nuance in the message, and usually when mass applying in centralist structures, it's a great distortion of what it was intended to do or the initially planned out.
Oh, you mean like corporate equity campaigns are mishandled? Because they're basically just a PR stunt, right?
More I was thinking economic policy and administration and stuff like this, not necessarily identity politics.
Yeah, in the short story, you have feminists advocating for reparations for women, men being impugned for having a bad attitude and eye raping, and that women can't be sexist. I don't know, it seems like a caricature. Ugly fat supervisors stealing credit from men, the manager stealing credit, that's capitalism. That's nothing to do with feminism. It seems like you're diluting valid criticism of feminism by introducing caricatures that are kind of bad faith, you know?
I wouldn't say they are bad faith. I would say it's the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because what seems to be beneficial now, without looking a lot into the future of how things could evolve, by applying small changes by multiple generations of activists. And by generations of activists, I would say, let's say a generation of activists would be a candidature. So the activists from this year are different from the activists from last year and so on. So this would be a generation of activists. It's someone working for a very narrow range of policies which seem to be beneficial in the short term, without looking what is the underlying principle of the activism and where it leads to, and when the activism is enough or satisfying. You could end up with something completely different from what you intended to 10, 20 generations ago. For example, do you think that the suffragists and the feminists from the 20s and 30s would even imagine that feminism today would be the way it is now?
I mean, probably. I mean, they had to form alliances with like black people to get voting rights and shit like that. It doesn't seem so hard to believe that intersectionality would evolve. I mean, it seems to me like you're committing a slippery slope fallacy, you know? Like, it seems to me like you're saying a potential for a dystopian feminazi future is a reason to not support women's rights today. It seems kind of cringe.
I didn't ever say anything about not supporting women's rights, and I don't think the story itself advocated for that.
All right, but you see how it could be seen as irresponsible the way you used a short story from Sargon, a literal white nationalist.
Sargon is a grifter with no principles, but I don't believe he's a white nationalist. What I said about the suffragists, do you think that the feminists in the early 20th century would have imagined things like parades of slut shaming with the freedom nipple movement and stuff like this? I mean, those at that time, because over several generations in the rhetoric about sexism started much later. It was something which wasn't seen by the earliest adopters.
I don't know. It seems like sexual liberation's a good thing. We should free the nipple. Okay, I'm not going to press too hard on any of these. I want to challenge you on some of what you believe, but I don't want to be complete like unfriendly. Great men create great times. That's something you said at near the end of your video. It seems like more of a storyline than it is necessarily reflective of reality, don't you think?
Well, since I said that, at least my conception and the way I encourage people to think about gender and masculinity would be something which is beneficial, then that would be offering reinforcements of that and ideals and encouraging people to think in ways in which it would make that outcome more likely.
So you basically want to pump them up so that they'll go out and act?
In what way?
I mean, when you're saying that great men create great times, you're basically trying to motivate people to create the great times?
Yeah.
Because I think the storyline itself, I mean, it's poetic, but the storyline itself is kind of bullshit. I mean, hard times have created terrible men. Economic anxiety, it drives radical movements. I mean, there's socialism, right, from that, but you can also get fascism. Hard times can create a bunch of weird things. I mean, the idea that a generation of people with great moral strength can somehow just lift a society out of the shadows, I mean, it disregards the institutions and the interests and the systems keeping them from doing that very thing. I don't think individual action or individual great men can create systemic change. You need to use collective movements and intentional policy ideas.
Yeah, I agree. I don't promote greatness in isolation, but collectively.
So how does great men create great times and that narrative? How does that help you create this collective greatness?
By addressing and praying and being vigilant about many things at once. And I would bring an example of something which we addressed earlier. How much do you know about royalty? You said that king being the ruler for being born in the royal family is bullshit. But do you know how princes and royalty was educated?
Not particularly. I would imagine at different times they were educated in different ways.
They were educated in as many aspects of culture and state rulership as possible. It was aimed as often as possible, and in many families, multidisciplinary. So put it as many aspects of stateship and administration as possible. What I'm saying is that people should have a wide range of things they are skilled in and sensitive in, including in terms of society and building structures and institutions, being vigilant about ways in which they could go wrong and ways in which that could be addressed. This being an attitude which is encouraged universally. So a lot of bad policies are passed because people are indifferent towards them. And I'm encouraging ways in which that would happen increasingly less, the more men are encouraged for this greatness and are encouraged both through inspirations and through plans and steps of getting to that, being skilled in as many aspects of as possible.
Yeah, so sure, I'm not in any way opposed, of course, to individual competence. It's just that I've heard a lot of the times the great men create great times create soft men and shit like that, you know? A lot of the time, that sort of narrative is pushed by like fascists and capitalists in a way to impugn people who feel bad about themselves, like saying, oh yeah, you're just weak. You're just in weak times. You gotta be strong. You gotta pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, you gotta machismo. You know, like it seems like that sort of narrative. It skews the way we view society towards the far right.
I actually brought up the great men create great times after bringing the example of good men create good times, because I put in my video a distinction between good times and great times. The good times being times which are prosperous, but great times being times which are both prosperous and knowing how to stop them from losing that prosperity. And because in the circular narrative, being in prosperous times would mean that a lot of people might get used to that and no longer do the necessary actions to keep it prosperous. And over time, as the narrative says, bad times will come.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm just saying that like that narrative has sometimes been used to say the opposite thing, you know? Like when you say that great men create great times and that great men would ensure the next generation would also grow up to be great men, Well, when we live in the system of capitalism where every 10 years there's inevitably an economic downturn, that's when people look to the system and say, our system is broken, let's fix it, let's implement some new welfare policies or get socialism or make some changes. And that's when the fascists come along or the capitalists come along and say, no, there's nothing wrong with our system, it's just that you people are weak. Our society has grown degenerate because of weak men. And that's sort of a way of invalidating the concerns of people on the left who want to create economic change to break the cycle of economic downturns. It seems like a way of enforcing the status quo, and that's just the danger that I see in it.
The way I see it is that a capitalist who doesn't understand upturns and downturns of the economy understands both capitalism less and is less good at being a capitalist. I'm taking the perception of capitalism from libertarianism and stuff like this, which talks about market economics. And when someone participating in the market doesn't understand how the market works and just says, as you say, that the status quo is right, someone who is less flexible and more authoritarian and doesn't understand the mechanism that the system needs to get out of a bad situation. Yeah, I see that as being less good at capitalism.
Yeah, because it just seems to me like, economic downturns, capitalism could be functioning at 100% capacity, but economic downturns would still happen, and millions of people would lose their jobs and fall into poverty at no fault of their own. And that, like, with a system such as this, you can't simply have people work harder or become smarter or become greater. Like, our system is intrinsically guaranteed to bring, layoffs when economic downturns inevitably happen. It seems like
what could happen would be encourage as much as possible people who look at these problems and know how to start businesses, just not to be employed, but to create employment, new businesses. If a lot of people or more people approach this perspective rather than job loss and stuff like this, when the economy goes bad, there is inspiration from new people to address the market problems and to create a bounce back. That would be a way in which capitalism would work better.
I'm not sure there's a way to make people better necessarily at innovating and creating new businesses. I mean, if people could do that, they would just do that when the economy is good. In an economic downturn, like, people aren't confident in the economy. That's the wrong time to invest, right? I don't think you can solve this problem by simply encouraging people to be better at starting businesses. Yeah, I just don't think a systemic change can be created just by telling individuals to be better.
It would also help by showing ways in which that could happen. Not having just the empty expectations, but also reinforcing it, teaching ways in which it could actually work, and putting aside myths which sound good, but don't work when applied.
All right, well, it was great talking to you. If you enjoyed our conversation, you might want to consider going over to Mass Creation Broadcast and listening to what he has to say. But otherwise, I'll see you next week with a new video.
I'm and I approve this message.